So you're seeing the name Tim Hortons here. I prefer to call them by a nickname that I came up with for them, Tim Horribles. Because I really do think they're a horrible chain for so many reasons. I've read and heard about how they're abusive to their workers. I've read so many stories about how they've fired various workers for inadequate reasons. That once minimum wage was raised, they took away workers' paid breaks. But my latest beef with Tim Hortons is the way that they've handled this entire pandemic, this COVID-19 pandemic. So, across Canada, there have been many restrictions that have been put in place due to the pandemic. And while some of those restrictions are being lifted, others are still in place. One of the restrictions that was put in place with restaurants have always been declared an essential service. And one of the restrictions that was put in place with restaurants is that they are allowed to stay open as long as they don't have their dining area open. So in other words, their dining area where people can sit down and eat, they've had to keep those dining areas closed across various jurisdictions, including here in the Canadian province of Ontario. Because of course the meaning behind that is that by keeping that dining area closed, you're going to have less people congregating, and you're going to have less spread of the coronavirus or COVID-19. So one of the ways to reduce the spread of COVID-19 is by social distancing, keeping at least 2 meters or 6 feet between one another. Well, the only legislation that was passed here in Ontario regarding COVID-19 and social distancing is that their dining rooms couldn't remain open. However, they could still keep their takeout counters open. They were still allowed to keep their public washrooms open. They were still allowed to have their drive-thrus open and still allowed to do delivery service as well too. Well, Tim Horribles, being the stingy, cheap chain that it is, decided to shut down their takeout counters altogether. So people on foot couldn't walk up to their takeout counters to order food for at least a few months since March of this year. They've had their public washrooms closed, even though there's no legislation requiring them to close their public washrooms. They still decided to close their public washrooms. So the only way to get Tim Hortons during the height of this pandemic was to go through their drive-thru. And in order to go through their drive-thrus, I saw at least one of their drive-thrus that only motorized vehicles were allowed to go through their drive-thrus. So people weren't allowed to walk through their drive-thrus. People weren't allowed to ride their bicycles or rollerblades or skateboards through their drive-thrus. You had to be in a motorized vehicle to go through their drive-thru. To me, that's discrimination. That's discriminating against people who don't have a car, don't have access to a car. And if you want to go a step further, it's actually discriminating against the poor. Because most poor people can't afford a car. What? Are people that don't have a car, don't have access to a car, are they any less worthy than people that do have a car? Are they any less deserving of being able to get themselves a coffee or a tea or a donut or any one of the other menu items that Tim Hortons sells? No, it shouldn't be that way. Like Tim Hortons prides themselves on being a community business to serve the community. But yet you're discriminating against a substantial portion of the community. people that don't have access to cars? And what about all those truck drivers and bus drivers who have continued to work through this pandemic, who have been unable to even stop at Tim Hortons to use their washroom or to get themselves food or drink from Tim Hortons because they have to have a motorized vehicle to go through their drive-through, but their bus or truck is too big to fit through a Tim Hortons drive-through. Shame on Tim Hortons. And you know what? Even though Tim Hortons, I know they have opened back some of their restaurants, dining rooms, and maybe even all of their restaurants. Well, I think their dining rooms are still closed here in Ontario, so you're not allowed to sit down and eat in there. But they've reopened at least some of their takeout counters, if not all. Even though they've reopened their takeout counters, I saw this one Tim Hortons location. The Tim Hortons location I'm going to single out is the Tim Hortons location at Commissioners Road and Deveron in London, Ontario, Canada. So it's basically on Commissioners Road, just west of Highbury Avenue, in the same plaza where there's a Food Basics supermarket. That was the first Tim Hortons I went to and saw a sign saying only motorized vehicles allowed through their drive-through. And I just went to that Tim Hortons last weekend, and I was about to walk in there to use their washroom, and they had up a sign still saying washrooms temporarily out of service. You can still walk into the restaurant between 5 a.m. and 11 p.m. to spend your money there, but God forbid you're not allowed to use their washroom because their washroom is still out of service. Well, I know a number of businesses are closing down or will be closing down, unfortunately, because of this pandemic. One of those businesses I will not miss if they do end up shutting down locations is Tim Hortons. The people I do feel sorry for at Tim Hortons, yes, I do feel sorry for those good workers at Tim Hortons that are doing a good job providing good customer service to the best of their ability. But as for the other Tim Hortons employees that don't give a damn about the people they're working with and serving, and as for Tim Hortons themselves, you know what I say? Fuck you, Tim Hortons. And I encourage people to boycott Tim Hortons. Tim Hortons sucks. And as I say, my name for them is Tim Horribles, because they really are a horrible restaurant.